Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for that. Can I just say that I welcome the government's bill. I welcome them bringing it forward now. And I also want to congratulate them on having listened. It's not always something that governments can be accused of, but this group, this Secretary of State and his Minister, very welcome Minister, has actually listened to a lot of concerns. They are now embedded in the bill, and I want to come to those in a second. I just want to deal with a couple of points here. I noticed quite recently that China said that any further interference, they would poke the eye out of the Five Eyes. Well, I think this bill puts the missing fifth eye back in to the Five Eyes because we've been laggard and lazy and late on this, and I think this would probably be the case across the board. So maybe that is a positive. Can I just deal with the honourable gentleman who made a very, very good speech earlier on? Durham, I think it is. Not Durham. He went on about this not being about China. He's quite right, it's not about China. There are plenty of security risks. My right honourable friend from New Forest East made that very point as chairman of the committee. There's lots and lots of security risk. Russia is a massive security risk to us and has probably more cyber attacks on us than anybody else. Yeah, it's debatable, but they have a very big criminal network that does attack us the whole time. So I accept that's absolutely right. But the difference with China now is that China is really the driving force as to why we are now coming to this with this bill, because they pose a very different kind of threat. The fact is they have juxtaposed the ability to dominate in a market sense, which sucks us in because of, and I'll come to Project Kowtow and some of the mistakes that were made, but at the same time then forcing us to turn a blind eye quite often to some of the work that they did, which we don't do with Russia and some of the more immediate threats. And so it's a peculiar and different challenge which is embedded now, therefore, in this bill. And I congratulate my right honourable friend for having made his earlier intervention, in which he pointed out, I thought really importantly, that this has been known about, this point, about the nature of our exposure for some considerable time. You know, we should have not ignored it, and I want to come back to that in a minute. I want to thank my colleagues who particularly, though, have been on the Huawei interest group very early on in the winter of last year and then into this year, have actually campaigned in a way to try and tighten up on these security areas, and also following that, the setting out of IPAC, which is now made up of 38 countries, left and right, politicians in every area, now asking for us to tighten up on our security cooperation and make sure we get this right. But this bill is long overdue and well welcome. There I want to make a couple of points very quickly about some of the issues in the bill. There are three really that I want to point out first of all. One, although not in the text of the bill, the reality that the government has now used its power to make an announcement that once in, they accept 2027 as the end point for, in this particular case, Huawei as one of the providers that may be high risk. And the second is, therefore, no new equipment in 2021. This is very, very welcome. In fact, the September 21 date is better than I would have expected at this particular point. So I congratulate them for being very clear about that. That is a more important date than 2027, in effect, because it opens the market and allows others to recognise now they have a possibility of re-entering a market that was closed to them by a company particularly, and there are other companies in China that has manipulated the normal rules of market adherence and subsidy, which has been a disaster for us not to recognise that on that alone, forgetting the security risk as well. I am, however, concerned on another point about the process that leaves the Secretary of State to make these decisions going forward against a criteria which is laid out later, and I want to come back to that. And I think my honourable friend said earlier on, who is to be the advisers? Who is to advise? And I think it's absolutely right, and he should listen to the chairman on this particular point, because it's important to structure who will advise the Secretary of State and how that will happen. And I think listening, and maybe the committee can have a very strong look at that, to advise the government about how to structure that. But there should be a more formal structure embedded in this. Otherwise, it would be too easy for a Secretary of State, under pressure from the Business Secretary, under pressure from a Chancellor, such as one that we once had, who was very keen on a golden era, and then leaning and saying, do you know what, do you really need to go down this road? Maybe that will happen. You know, I sat as the Secretary of State. I can tell you now, all that stuff happens, and anybody else will tell you too. So I think a more structured approach does not allow the Secretary of State to miss the right people on advice would be very important. And also, I think the issue around the descriptions in Section 16 21, I think, 05Z, is important. And I want to come back to those because that list gives them plenty of scope. And so tightening up on the, the advice means that that scope isn't therefore wasted. But we're here because of the mistakes of the golden era, the great kowtow, as I would rather call it, to ignore the realities of what was going on in security terms too often for the sake of this great drive that somehow we were going to be benefiting massively from the opening up of trade with China. And also the mistaken belief, which is too often the case here amongst liberal democracies and all of us who believe in freedom of speech and the general freedoms, we kind of believe somehow rather arrogantly that all we have to do is open up markets and everybody else realizes their system must be wrong and therefore they will change it. You know, that was the great belief. I was told this endlessly, by the way, in government. Oh, don't worry about this sort of stuff. Don't worry, they will change once they realize just exactly how wonderful it is to trade with the West. Well, they did not. And they don't want to change because they think that their form of government is a better form of government. Now, they will say that we're opened up to the markets, we're getting the benefits of the marketplace. They were invited to join the WTO, China, back in 2001 at that stage, and there have been real problems since then in market forces, but I want to come back to the security elements. So the worry is that others of the Five Eyes spotted what was going on long before us. And we ignored a lot of the evidence that was there, that we should have been tightening up much, much earlier. We should have been concerned. I can't remember who here said, security must be, just one second, security must be the number one consideration over everything else. Well, we lost that. I hate to say this. We lost that, and we consider it as just one of the things we might look at. I give way to the entrepreneur.
I'm not one for doing the government's job or supporting it, but I don't think we did actually in terms of the Huawei Security Centre. We're actually ahead, I think, of other countries which didn't do that, including the United States, that allowed Huawei into their country networks without any checks whatsoever. But the issue has got to be about security. I know the right-wing journalists have strong views about being anti-China trade, but security has got to be at the heart of it, which I think is where we've been up till now.
Well, I have to say I don't agree with him in this. And that's because although the Cybersecurity Centre was installed and it was about Huawei, when I sat and listened to them earlier on in the year when they made a presentation to us, it was almost though you were watching people who were kind of squeezing their own genuine, real opinion that would have been coming via GCHQ about the real threat was formed because their arguments didn't stand up, even in the face of people who were not every day working on security. The truth is that if we're not careful, this should have been a tighter position from the word go. The very fact the government's bringing it forward now suggests that that was not the case. That was not the case. Yeah, I'm critical of my own government. I resigned from the damn thing at one point. And I have to say that I therefore do believe it's possible for great governments like mine to get things wrong. Though I'm not quite sure what I can say the same. I'll give way to my friend.
Very briefly, I would just like to say, in defence of the Huawei Cyber Security Evaluation Centre, when you read their 6th annual report, for example, of September this year, it is absolutely devastating in its criticisms of the failures of Huawei to be secure or to make improvements when those securities have been highlighted.
I agree completely. The point is that at the time when we were talking about this earlier on, it was quite clear that that was underneath it all their real opinion, but they were kind of moving and modifying, and I don't therefore think that, and they were used, by the way, in a political way, which I didn't think was right. Your opinion is either there or it isn't. Don't get them to come in and brief backbenchers about what they should be thinking at the time. I thought that was wrong. Absolutely we're in the right place at this point. I think this bill goes a long way towards doing that. I think, however, there's some other things that we need to do, which we could do on the bill. I noticed, for example, I know it's about security, this bill, but it does say something on the face of it, which says it's slightly wider than security. It says, and I think my honourable friend signed this bit, it says that the view of the provisions of the Telecom Security Bill are compatible with the Convention of Rights. Now, part of the Convention of Rights is human rights. And it has to be said that we need to ask ourselves the question whether that applies to many regimes and companies that come from those regimes, and just China alone, that may be guilty of human rights abuses. And I did ask him previously in a private context whether he would consider in that way, in the section that I think is 105Z8 designation notices, including the ability where that may rise for something even in the area of genocide and for companies to be involved in that process. There is very strong evidence in a couple of cases, particularly in the Uyghur case, that there may be use of slave labour in some companies. Now, that should outlaw them. Now, he may argue this may not be the bill for that because it is specifically security, but it does always have on the face of it that we abide by human rights, even on every bill. I'm not trying to widen its scope. I'm giving the Minister the opportunity to have, as part of his possible designations, that extra element. After all, we are dealing with countries and nations, particularly in the case of China, that has torn up much of the book on cooperating and diplomacy. And I want to just raise the last point, Deputy Speaker, and I'm then going to conclude. Quite recently, and this refers, my honourable friend has gone, he raised the issue of Australia. I just want to say, as one of our Five Eyes partners, Australia had the temerity to ask for an inquiry into the outbreak on COVID. And since then, they have been massively, essentially attempted to be beaten up by the Chinese in a very undiplomatic and very aggressive manner. It started with abuse of the individuals that asked for it. It then went on further to abuse of the government. Sometimes it's gone on to sanctions. They've now broken the WTO in the sense they're reporting over 200% sanctions on Australian wine. They have openly, this last couple of days, produced what I think is called a meme, which is a mocked-up instrument on the internet, where they show something about an Australian soldier trying to kill a child. This is appalling behaviour. And I want my government at some point to be very clear this behaviour is simply not to be borne. And therefore, although we have said we stand with China, I think the key thing about this sort of thing in cooperation with our Five Eyes partner, we should do more than stand with them. We should condemn behaviour like that, which deliberately targets and demeans a democratic nation that goes by the rule of law and human rights, which is something that they do not do. So I do hope he'll pass back to his colleagues that no matter what we do on this bill, we need to make sure that we stand up with those of our Five Eyes partners now that we've got the security bill in, now that we're moving in that direction, and we will never allow any one of them to be isolated and picked off one at a time. I commend this bill.
Number 10 withdrawn, so we go straight to the Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ell.
Deputy Speaker, thank you. Does that mean I get 16 minutes? That's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. That's